Welcome, friends. You're tuned in to another episode of On .NET Live, where our mission is to empower you, the .NET community, to achieve more. I'm your host, Scott Addie, joined with co-hosts Maira Wenzel and Cam Soper. We are super excited to have today's guest on the show, Matt Groves. Matt, would you like to briefly introduce yourself?
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me on the show. I'm Matt Groves. I work for Couchbase as a DevRel engineer, and my job is similar to yours, to help developers learn and do cool stuff.
Great. Sounds like an awesome job. My understanding is, so today we're going to talk about a topic called, or a project called Conduit. I think we should start the conversation here, assuming that most folks in the audience have never heard of Conduit, and just start with a brief intro. Why would someone who's watching this be interested? Does that sound good?
Sure, yeah, that's fine. Happy to do that. So Conduit is part of a project called the Real World Project, and well, let's start a little bit earlier than that. So let's talk about open source a little bit, right? So open source projects, there's tons of them out there, and they allow us to build very diverse types of environments and all kinds of different tools we can use. And there are tons of people out there all using different kinds of tools. And so if we want to learn some of these tools, often it helps to look at a demo project to see those tools in action, whether it's a framework, a database, a language, whatever, all the above maybe. But, there are lots of demo apps out there, but they're always scattered around different places. They do different things. It's hard to compare and contrast, right? So this project, the Real World Project, attempts to help address that problem. It's an open source initiative. And what they do is they publish a spec of an application called Conduit, which is a clone of medium.com, the social blogging site. Hopefully most of you've heard of medium.com, but it's a clone of medium.com. And so they publish a spec. And I'll show you some of these details here in a second if you want to look at them. But the spec then can be implemented by anyone using any sort of language, framework, database, front end and back end and full stack. And then once you've implemented that, you can submit it to the Real World Project and they will index that. So then you can go to this site and look through hundreds of projects, all doing the exact same thing, but built with different tools, languages, and frameworks. So you can find them all in one place and compare and contrast to other projects going on. So that's the Conduit project. That's what that is. And I'm actually working on an implementation of that with ASP.NET and Couchbase. So I'm currently doing that on Twitch, doing that on a live stream as well. So I'm building it live in front of the world as I go through, showing all my decisions, my mistakes, and publishing that code for everyone to look at. So that's the way it works.
It's very brave.
I do
It's
have
very,
one
very
question.
fun. Yeah. Go ahead.
Matt, you'd mentioned a spec that's published. Who is it that's responsible for defining that spec and evolving it?
Yeah, so it is an open source project, right? So there are maintainers of this project. I think the primary sort of steward of this project is a company called Thinkster, and they are a training company. But yeah, there's open source stewards of this project, and the spec itself is something that should not change. Well, it should not change very often, right? Because if it does change, then it makes those hundreds of projects kind of out of date. So the spec is pretty much well defined. It's a very minimum medium clone. We can actually take a look at the spec if you want to see some examples of it here.
Yeah,
I'd
sure.
be interested in that.
Yeah, so let me share my screen here.
And I do have a follow-up question on that
Sure.
as well. You mentioned this is a clone of medium.com.
Yeah.
Why the need for a clone? What's the unique problem that it aims to solve?
Right. So if you think of demo projects, sometimes you think of a to-do or a hello world type of project, and those are fine. There's value to those, but you want to use a more real world implementation of something that can really put these frameworks, these tools to the test, so that you're doing stuff that's closer to real world. However, you don't want to do something that's too crazy, that's overwhelming, especially for someone who's new to a language or a framework or a database. So I think, I wasn't involved in the decision, but I think a social blog site contains a lot of problems that can be challenging to different frameworks and databases and languages. So it's a pretty good way to show those things in action without being too overwhelming.
And you have the same project implemented in different languages as well, right?
That's right. That's right. So this here is the backend specs on the real world site. This is showing the backend endpoint. So there's authentication header. Here's the authentication endpoint. So it's just a URL, what the request should look like, links to the different entities, and what's required. So it's a very, very simple, very not very complex spec here. And it's only as you can see on the right side, only a dozen or so, 20 different endpoints. So it's a lot that you could use to get a real site up and running, but it's not going to get into the real, complex domains that a Medium would probably actually have, right? Medium's going to have a lot more than these endpoints. This is like a minimum viable product, basically. So you can see all the endpoints here, and I'm kind of, this is how far I've gotten in my implementation, the unfollow user. These are still the ones I have to implement. But as you can see in let's see if I can go to the right tab here. Yeah. So here is a list of the projects that they're currently indexing. So I've just clicked on backend here, and you can see there's dozens and dozens of projects. So if we just do a quick search for Couchbase, you can see there's a couple already for Express, Node, Ottoman, and Couchbase. I think there's another one for Java, so Spring Data, Spring Boot, and Couchbase. So you can go through this list and you can see which languages are being used. You can filter by which language you like, and they're all here. And these all just go directly to, so if I went to the Couchbase one, this goes directly to a GitHub repo where I can just clone this, and there's instructions to get it running and show you how to configure it. And away you go.
And just for clarity, so we're talking about a RESTful API here, and that's the reasoning why we're not preferring one language over another. Language really doesn't come into play here. It's all about connecting to that API with your language of choice.
Right. Yeah. So REST is kind of the common language between the front ends here, which are going to be other, Angular and Blazor and whatnot, and they communicate with the backend. So that spec is what connects these to each other. So if I wanted to, I could have any one of these backends match with any one of these front ends because they all follow the same spec. So I can mix and match between those as well.
And someone was asking again, what is Conduit? So Conduit is the app that is the Medium clone, right? So that's
Yes,
the name
that's right.
of the app.
Right. So, I mean, you could call it the app or you call it the spec itself.
The spec. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of interchangeable name, but yeah. So this is the Conduit spec, which you can use to build a Conduit app.
Got it.
Yeah, and they actually
Now,
have a demo. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So as folks who are passionate about .NET, what might something like this look like in, say, C# code? Do we have an example?
Yeah, sure. That's what I'm working on right now, actually. So I've got a project right here, and this is not listed on the real world site yet because it's not completed yet, but I can give you the URL for that if you want to take a look and comment, contribute. But yeah, so this is a project right here, and I've got an ASP.NET Core 7 project. I've got a test project, migrations from my database. I've gotten some benchmarks as well. But if you look into this, you can look at, let's say, the users controllers. And these are the endpoints that I've grouped together in one users controller class that have to do with authentication and profiles and login and so on. So this is a very well-documented endpoint because this is going to be used to generate the Open API documentation. So I want this to be very clear about what this endpoint does. And I'm using Mediator in here. But basically, I'm just passing this off to Mediator and using just a bunch of very thin endpoints in ASP.NET Core is my my design here. So that's one. Here's the next one: registration and so on.
Is implementing Open API part of the spec? Do all the backends have to do that?
It is not actually. Open API is not part of the spec. In fact, what they do is, if we go back to the documentations, they actually provide a Postman collection to test the endpoints with, right? So it's, again, well-defined API, so they can provide a Postman collection for that, which is fine. I personally like to use Open API, Swashbuckle, and Swagger in this project. So if I run this, I think I already did run this, in fact. Yeah, right here. So here's my Open API Swagger UI generated from that. And that's where the documentation comes in that I showed you with all those triple slashes there. So if we go to login, you can see all the documentation is there from my comments. This will link right to the Conduit spec for that login, and so on. So that's I like it because it's built right into the browser. I can just run it right there while I'm working. But Postman is a perfectly good option as well.
See, we're getting questions in the chat regarding which is better, gRPC versus REST. Kind of related to the question, I'm going to put a link to a doc in the chat that will help answer that question. In short, the answer is it depends. Taking the easy way out there.
I would agree with that. I don't think that this Conduit project would have gRPC in it because it's all REST spec. But I suppose that That could be another project they added to real world, maybe a Conduit gRPC version. They could try that.
Very cool. Now you had mentioned, Matt, Mediator. I believe that's a Jimmy Bogard open source project. What
is.
need or what purpose is that serving within this application?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not using it extensively, and basically just using it as a very simple request response. But the idea here is it's just a way to keep my kind of business logic and validation logic separate from my controllers, separate from my data access, with an eye on, in the future, if scaling was a concern, I wanted to go to microservices or something, I could implement some sort of CQRS here if I needed to or wanted to. But I can just show you a handler here for, like, let's say a login request handler. It's a place I can also use to kind of gather up my dependencies that I need to handle whatever request the user has. But this is doing some logic, and it's delegating to data services, to the auth service, things like that. So it's a very simple request response here, type of usage.
Thanks for explaining that. The other question I had, so I assume at some point, we're connecting to this backend REST API. Auth comes into play.
Yes.
How does one authenticate to a service like that?
Yeah. So the real world spec here actually discusses that. So it's using JWT, which is if you're not familiar with that, it's a big token that encodes some data and also has an expiration date. So when you log in, find the login endpoint here. Oh yeah, this one right here. This is a login endpoint. It will return a user, and the user includes the email and whatnot, but also includes this token. So as long as the front end holds on to this token, it's passed into the other endpoints. So for instance, update user, you see here, requires authentication. So if we look at the update user endpoint, if I find that one here, right here, update user has this authorize attribute on it, which means that you must have a valid JWT token in order to use this endpoint. So JWT is something I learned about as I started working on this project, actually. And I'm not going to claim to be the best JWT implementation, but I used some existing JWT authentication packages to do this. And you have to supply some tokens to do that. These are not supposed to be shown to the public, but these will definitely be changed before I go anything like production. These are hard coded for now. That's one of my tickets, is to put those into application settings or secrets or something.
Well, and now you'll have to reissue it too.
Right, exactly. But fortunately, no one's actually got any tokens out in the wild yet, so I'm not super concerned about it.
So it looks like you're just using the ASP.NET Core identity based methods here, the add jot bearer method.
That's right. Yeah, it's just built in ASP.NET JWT support. I think there's another package I added. Let me take a look here for JWT specifically. Why can't I manage my projects? Hello, why is that grayed out? I'll try to recompile here. Visual Studio seems to be. Oh, there we go. Okay. Wow, I can't look at my projects for some reason. There we go. So there's so I've got this JWT bearer package included in order to support that.
Okay. So it looks like you're using, I'm looking at other third-party dependencies folks might be interested in here. So you've got Mediator. We discussed the role that plays. Looks like you're using Fluent validation. Could you talk about maybe how that plays into this bigger picture?
Yeah. So obviously validation is important when we're receiving any sort of data from a user or a front end. And I like Fluent validation. I like Fluent stuff in general, but Fluent validation works nicely here. So I can show you, again, back to like the handler. I create a validator class, and it gets passed in here as a dependency. And that is just going to validate a certain type. And I can show one of those validators, login request validator. Yeah, right there. And so this is a separate class that encapsulates all the validation data for this particular request object. In this case, the email is required and password is required. Nothing particularly crazy with this one. It's just they must be required. And then, of course, we got to hit the database to test if they're valid or not at some point. But these can get actually complicated. So I'll show another one. Let's see, registration validator. That might be a good one. Yeah, so this one's a little more complex, where I've got some validations for like the username. You can't change your username to someone else's username. That should not be allowed, right? There's some password rules as well. Those are actually a shared validator. If I could find that one. You can actually reuse validation logic between classes. But here's where all the password logic is, username length, valid email address, and so on. And you can create custom, well, I'm not sure what happened there. You can create custom validation functions to use within there. So I just kind of split these all out to make it more readable. But password must contain a digit, password must contain an uppercase letter, and so on.
And so here we're looking at the API like the API calls implementation, right? And does this project also have front end in .NET as well?
Right. So I'm working on just a backend.
Mhm.
I'm not much of a front end developer myself, but there
Okay.
are, of course, if I can find the page here, a whole bunch of front end examples as well. Right. So these are all written in front end languages. So Blazor is an example of one you could use, Blazor and WebAssembly. That might be the only C# one on there that I know of, but certainly that's one option. There's plenty in TypeScript as well for Angular and Next.js.
I'm sensing an opportunity for enterprising viewers.
Absolutely. Yes. If you're interested in creating a front end here in Blazor, maybe you want to use some sort of twist on Blazor, you can go ahead and do that. Plenty of room for that in this project. And the backend as well. I'm creating ASP.NET plus Couchbase, and there are backends that are, a lot of them are using SQLite or SQL Server, so there's opportunity for Postgres or Oracle, whatever else you're working with, if you want to put that example out here too.
Yeah, the C#, I don't know if you'd refer to these as demo apps or templates or what they are, but the list was a little short there. So definitely opportunity for our viewers. I wanted to ask, so we're calling a REST API here.
Mhm.
At some point, even though we might believe it's not true, at some point that spec, that underlying spec will evolve. How does this thing version? And like, how do you react to something like that in your application?
It's a good question, and I've not faced that yet in this real world project. So, but I mean, I suppose if you wanted to version, right, there's different approaches to REST versioning. You could, I could start putting a V1 on a lot of these endpoints, for instance. So in many cases, look at my controllers, I just have the URL right here. But I could, if I go back to the controller level, or even maybe at the app level, I could put a /v1/v2 on that sort of thing. Of course, another approach is, it's always the latest version, right? Which is maybe a little more dangerous sometimes, but then I have to go in and make sure these endpoints are matching the latest version. Whatever endpoints are missing or have been removed get dealt with appropriately. So that's another approach.
So it sounds to me like the spec has no opinions on how to version. It doesn't force you one direction or another. Is that correct?
I don't think it's even mentioned. That's it's probably a reasonable concern if someone wants to modify the spec. How do we deal with that? Because then you might have a situation where these projects here, not only do I have a front end and back end tab, but I also have a V1 and V2 tab, and so on. So that would probably be a refactoring of the whole real world project, in fact. It's a good thing to bring up. They actually have a discussion forum on GitHub to ask various questions about the Conduit spec, and that might be a good topic to bring up.
Yeah. Just looking at the chat here to see what folks are interested in hearing about. Latest comment says seems there's full stack too.
Yeah.
Maybe that's worth exploring here. So if we go with something in the full stack tab, is there anything .NET like in there, or is I see JavaScript?
Yeah, I don't see any .NET or C# in full stack. There's some TypeScript, of course, but yeah, I'm guessing full stack would be I'm doing the whole stack. My project is front end and back end. So there are some versions of that, right? So here's Laravel, which is a back end, Vue front end, and Postgres database.
Lots of opportunities for folks that are interested in trying out this project here to give it a try. And so is there an evolution of this, or is like pretty much stable? And so right now is just a matter of adding some of the backlog items that you have there. Is that something that you work by yourself, or do you want help as well from our community?
I am working through this. I'm making. So this whole project I'm working on, this real world example app in ASP.NET and Couchbase. Certainly, one of the deliverables is the code base itself. Yes. So certainly, I would appreciate help, collaboration on that. If you want to join on my live streams, you can kind of comment as we go along, or ask questions, or point things out. That's one way to do it. But certainly, a lot of the other deliverables I'm working on with this project are beyond just this code base, right? So once I have a complete code base to start from, now we can explore individual aspects of that and do deeper dives on parts of that. So I've been making a list as I go along of, okay, let's do a JWT deep dive. Let's do a data structures deep dive. Let's do an authentication deep dive. So this is a great baseline to kind of launch other efforts, certainly Couchbase related efforts, to use a standard project and help developers learn how to do cool stuff. And if they're not familiar with Couchbase, this is a great place to see, well, if I'm building an endpoint like this, what should I do with Couchbase versus an endpoint like this? And so, Couchbase is a NoSQL database, so there's lots of different options interacting with data. There's a key value API and there's a SQL API. So when do I use which of those data access methods? And so that's a great way to demonstrate those concepts in action with this kind of standard demo app.
So has your focus been simplicity or performance?
Why not both? So yeah, that's kind of exactly what I'm talking about when we're talking about key value and SQL API, is that with both those approaches, I can do reads and writes in Couchbase, but which one is more performant? And sometimes there is a complexity trade-off there, right? So, I might recommend a SQL query for this endpoint, but only because I can't do it with the key value endpoint, right? So there's an overhead involved with a query engine as opposed to a key value lookup. So certainly simplicity in terms of code base, trying to do that as best I can. Always open to comments on that. But that's why I want to keep these controllers as relatively thin as possible, right? So keep those thin, keep the mediators themselves thin, keep the data access thin, so that everything's doing one job, right? But you also notice here this benchmarks project using benchmarks.net. This is where I was considering different, I find the class name here. Yeah, different data structures in Couchbase, different APIs for use with the follow unfollow API. Which approach is the fastest and which approach is the easiest to implement, right? And there's some trade-offs involved there. So this is, definitely highlighting that there's trade-offs versus simplicity and performance. So it's a very good point.
See, what are we seeing in the chat here? Anything interesting?
Someone wants the GitHub URL. I think I just showed that, but I'll paste in the chat there if you're interested.
We pasted there, so I
you
think
did. You got it. Okay,
that one is covered. Yeah.
And I wouldn't call it the .NET GitHub URL. It's just a. So certainly you can create your own ASP.NET or whatever .NET backend you want to use, or front end for that matter.
Matt, you had mentioned, an opportunity to collaborate with you on your live stream with the work you're doing here. Did you want to share info with the viewers on that live stream and where they
Sure.
could find you?
Yeah, sure. So I'm on Twitch. There, Matthew D. Groves on Twitch. I'm part of the Live Coders team on Twitch as well. So if you're familiar with Live Coders, I'm one of the Live Coders. And so those videos are also available on YouTube, the recordings, if you want to kind of catch up. And I'm working on a series of edited summary videos, so you don't have to watch a full 3-hour stream to get the general idea of what's going on. So those are all parts of this project as well. And you can get links to those at the bottom here of the README. Here's all the video links I've entered so far into Twitch and the save to YouTube.
Cool stuff. Is there anything? So I'm just kind of putting myself in the shoes of the viewers, and they may be wondering, hey, this Conduit thing sounds amazing, but are there any really good starting points for learning more about it, like getting started tutorials or anything of that sort?
Yeah. So if you want to build your own implementation, for instance, is that what you're talking about, or using one of them?
Yeah. So let's say I want to do what you're doing with your
Okay.
Couchbase repo, creating that project. How would one start down a path like that?
Yeah. So I would start here at this intro page. That's exactly what that's designed for. They have a kind of a starter kit, baseline GitHub repo that you can fork from and get started. And then, there's lots of material here to kind of walk through how the project works, what the specs about. And you can just kind of go through this, these links over here on the left and just read through. It's not very involved, right? So it's designed not to be intimidating. So these are, very few instructions on to actually build. As long as you follow the spec, it doesn't really matter how you build it or what you build with. So Postman's a possibility. You could also stick to Swagger. You could also do command line curl if you want to. It's all up to you.
Do you have a UI that's your favorite for testing your backend?
Yeah, I haven't gotten into that yet. Certainly would like to explore Blazor some more, but as I said, I'm really incompetent when it comes to UI. So whichever one works is one I'll be sticking with. But if you want to see the UI in action, they actually have a site set up at demo.realworld.io if you want to check it out there. So this, I'm not sure which one this is using, probably React and one of the backends, but this is the Conduit action or Conduit website in action. So you can click around and test the functionality. It's all just, filler content, but you can see all the functionality here. And so you could pair this up with a whatever backend you want to, is the idea here.
And this is like to help folks to understand how to build, like to have a real demo app of an end-to-end project so that they can learn how to do things with REST APIs on their projects. Is that like the whole concept behind this?
Certainly REST is part of it, right? But the idea here is that it's all the exact same. It's the exact same app in different applications. So if you are, say, trying to learn a new framework, you can find that framework in here and see how it's used in this real world project, right? So if you're not familiar with Couchbase, this might be a good place to start. If you know Node already, you could see how Couchbase is being used in this project. Or if you're not familiar with Spring Boot, but you're familiar with Couchbase, let's say, you go the other way and say, well, okay, well, I'll look up, see how Spring Boot's used in this case. And it's just examples that can be reference examples that can just help you learn and compare and contrast these approaches. So someone more ambitious than me could probably start to collect stats about all these projects to see, well, this one used 1,000 lines of code. This one used 800 lines of code. So not that that's a fair comparison, right? But that might be some place you could start and say, well, the most concise examples are written in Rust, but the most verbose examples are written in Java, that sort of thing. And so that might be a good macro experiment to compare and contrast these implementations to come to some conclusions.
How active is the community behind Conduit? I assume they're on GitHub, but let's say I have some sort of problem I've encountered and I need to, file an issue to get support.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So again, there's kind of two different things, right? There's the Conduit spec, the real world project, and you can actually find a community, a very active community on that spec where you can ask questions about the spec, and lots of different resources available there. GitHub discussions, as I mentioned, there's plenty of discussion here on GitHub. These are just the community ones, but there's all the discussions about all the different specs and questions and so on. But then if you want to get into the actual individual projects, I mean, that's going to vary based on how many people are using it and so on. So this is the very first one on the list: Camel, Spring Boot, JSLT. Don't know what half those things are, but you can see this project updated 4 months ago. It's relatively recent. So it's got a number of stars that will keep growing as people use this more. So if you have a detail or a specific implementation detail, then it's going to vary based on the GitHub repo. But the actual real world community is very large and active as a whole.
I find myself kind of wondering how many of these are like edge case, like somebody's little passion project framework that nobody actually uses in the real world, right?
So yeah, good question. So there actually is, I did mention this, there actually is a requirement, and I'm not sure where it is on here, that whatever libraries you use have to have a certain number of stars in them, right? So let me find that somewhere. Yeah. So I don't think this is a hard and fast rule, right? But they're looking for libraries, frameworks, databases that have, a significant amount of stars. So if I created, a fork of ASP.NET called ASP.MAT, they're not going to really want that kind of example project here, right? They're going to stick to the one. So, but yeah, so that's kind of the general rule of thumb: is it's got to be a relatively well-known library, framework, database.
And is it something that they could, for example, if someone wanted to do a different kind of backend, could they fork your project and use like your basic API implementation, but with a different database in the backend or something? Is that something that people do here as
Oh
well?
yes, oh absolutely. So I think I can actually find an example of that. So if we look at the was a Java project, right? Maybe it was this one. Let's see. So this recent Couchbase one was actually, no, that's not it. It's the Java one. It's the JavaScript one. So this one was actually, if you look here, forked from someone else's real world server. And so this is a Couchbase implementation. They forked it from a Mongo implementation.
Mm-hmm.
So they kind of took what Mongo was doing and then similar databases. They're both JSON databases, right? And so there's a lot of the framework, a lot of the construction already in place, and you can just take that existing code and replace the database and the ODM in that case. So absolutely, yes. And I would actually welcome that. So I don't know if there's licensing requirements for this, right? But mine is certainly a permissive license. It is MIT, I believe. Yeah, MIT. So absolutely, you can fork this to whatever reason you want to fork it with, and I'm happy if people do that.
One other thing I'm curious about is you mentioned a test collection for Postman. Do you have that readily available? We could possibly take a look at it.
I didn't prepare it, but let me see. It's probably the last thing I did in Postman, so we can take a look. No guarantees it's going to actually work because I haven't touched this in a while. Like I said,
we
I'm
did
more
put
of
you on the spot. So
more of a swashbuckle. But yeah, so here's the Conduit collection. Zoom in a little bit. You can see all these different Postman actions are defined in this collection. So if I click on register, yeah, you can see it kind of gives you this template already. So I put in a defined API URL. It gives me an example of what that JSON will look like. That's not an example. That's my own additions there. But yeah, and then so it's got those things pre-configured, so you can use these all to test your endpoints with that Postman collection. So here's update article. I haven't done update article endpoint yet, but this is what that would look like. There's the example of the request there. It's a put request with a JSON body.
Yeah, I can imagine this being very useful as you're just getting started trying to learn the functionality.
Yeah. And one other cool thing about this is, I don't know if you, I learned this recently, is that you can actually take a Postman collection and run it from the command line. And so you could turn this into integration tests if you want to, just this directly. So that could be a very useful thing to use the Postman collection for as well.
Okay, now you've got me wondering what that looks like. Is that something you're willing to share with us?
So again, not something that I've done, but I think my colleague Laurent, when he built the Java one here, we can take a look at that. I can show you what the GitHub workflow looks like. Workflow service container. So this is, let's see, it's called Newman, I believe is what it's called. So where is that on here? Here. Maybe it is in the other one. Maybe it's in the JavaScript one. I just saw this in one of the projects. I was like, what's that? What's Newman? So I thought that was very cool. Yeah, here it is at the bottom there. So Postman tests, it's going to run that shell script, and that shell script is running Newman. We can take a look at that if you want to look at the detail there, but that's just one of the steps in this this test job here in GitHub workflow. So let's look at here's Postman. There's run API tests. So here's Newman, which will run that Postman collection at the command line. So it'll run all those endpoints for us. Pretty cool. I haven't added that to my project yet, but yeah, that's a pretty cool reuse of the Postman collection.
I saw in one of the pages for the spec there that there were some performance benchmarks that they run as well. Is that something that they update it yearly? Like it seemed like it had different years.
Okay, so I think I know what you're talking about, but I'm not sure where it's at. They did a series of benchmarks.
You got, it was one of the,
here we go.
There, yes, yeah.
So they haven't done it in a while, right? But these are only front end benchmarks. So they're only the testing is front end to get the same exact back end. This is something we're actually considering doing at Couchbase in the future, is to do some back end benchmarks to be a useful comparison in that sense. But yeah, these are all against the front end benchmarks, and I think that there's you can see kind of the different runtime of these various endpoints. So yeah, this is kind of a fun output. Like I mentioned, this is more of a meta analysis of all the different projects to see how they do in this particular situation. But yeah, I haven't seen one in a while. There are so many front ends these days. I mean, that might be the reason they haven't done this.
But very cool. Yeah, no, I'll certainly look around there and see. Like,
I don't
how
know
we
if Blazer's
stack
on
up.
any
I
of
don't know
these.
if
So that might be a
if the
good thing
maybe it's
to
too new
improve.
for,
Yeah.
it hasn't been in the latest ones.
David Pine, if you're watching, I need you to fix this.
Yeah, I'm sure he doesn't have enough to do already. I just saw David at a conference a couple weeks back.
He mentioned that, yeah.
Yeah, he showed the picture.
Okay.
I'm over here reading about Newman. Now I've got something to play around with this afternoon. There goes the rest of my day. For folks that are interested, I did paste a link to the Newman NPM package in chat. There it is up on the banner on the screen. If you were wondering what was being used from the command line with Postman, it's that thing there, that package. So I know I've exhausted all of my questions. Maira, Cam, did you have anything you wanted to ask about?
I don't have any specific questions. I just think this is a great project for anybody who is wanting to learn a new framework, who's coming from someplace where they like have some existing knowledge of, okay, I might know Spring, but how does the same task get done over here in this other framework? I think that's a fantastic paradigm for a demo app, and I wish there were more resources like this that were, like, here's how you do the same thing in 18 different frameworks.
Yeah, I love that concept too. I think I exhausted my questions too, so it's like if I think maybe we can turn to Matthew to see if he has more things he would like to share with us, but otherwise we can finish a few minutes early as well.
Yeah, Matt, do you have any other resources you wanted to share with our viewers?
I mean, certainly, I'd like you all to check out Couchbase Capella if you want to get started with that. You can go to couchbase.com
Yeah,
and learn
so
more.
I've not. I am coming from this from a place of not knowing much about Couchbase, and I heard you compare it to Mongo earlier.
Mhm.
Is that kind of the elevator pitch? What's the
Elevator pitch for Couchbase is, not just we're a better Mongo. No, no, but I'd say we are a very different architecture compared to Mongo, but we are great for very high scale uh, public applications, mobile applications. We have a complete data platform. My favorite elevator pitch of Couchbase is SQL++. So if you know how to write SQL, you can take those skills and apply them to NoSQL, high scale JSON data. It's a backwards compatible language. So joins and CTEs and everything you expect from SQL, just with JSON NoSQL data. So that's my favorite thing about it. Um, the
Very
other
cool.
thing I would thought I'd mention is that that's kind of one of the other deliverables we're working on is, you know, um, there's no way we can have Couchbase employees build examples for every language and every framework. It's just not going to happen. As much as I'd like to make that my full-time job, it's not going to work. So one of the things we're looking at doing is actually kind of making our own version of this spec, a more detailed spec. So we can start with this great Conduit spec and then say, well, for this endpoint, here's the operation you should do in Couchbase. So that way we can give that spec to someone in the community or to a contractor or whoever, and then they could build their own version of the real world application in whatever language they want to use. So this would be a great way to create a blueprint for people to also work on that. So now there's even less work for them to do. Now they have a spec, a Couchbase spec, and they have other languages to compare it to. So it's going to take a lot of the friction away from getting started building an application, whether it's proof of concept or for your own personal learning or whatever the reason is. We're trying to reduce that friction as much as possible.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing all of that with us. I think we're ready to wrap up the show for the day. However, before we do that, I'd like to thank both Matt for sharing his expertise here and for all of our viewers for tuning in today. As a reminder, we do have recordings of other .NET live TV streams like the one you watched today over at dot.net/live. And if you tune in next week, it'll be Monday again. We'll be joined by guest Weston Walker, and he'll be talking to us about his open source project that's used for building web apps. And the project is called Blazor Spark. Hope to see you then, and we'll learn what that is all about. Thanks, friends.